It was the middle of a blistering summer afternoon in California, where the heat hung thick in the air like a heavy blanket. The sky was cloudless, its deep blue color almost suffocating, and the streets of Oak Ridge, a quiet town nestled on the edge of the Sierra Nevada mountains, breathed a heavy sigh. The sun beat relentlessly on everything it touched. But despite the heat, there was a storm brewing in the shadows of one unsuspecting house. Inside the two-story home at 1-159 Aspen Avenue, Linda Marshall was at the kitchen counter, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a coffee mug, her eyes distant. She had lived in Oak Ridge for most of her life, married to the town's most respected sheriff, Robert Bob Marshall. To the outside world, their life appeared perfect. A steady job, a beautiful home, and a marriage that seemed unbreakable. But Linda's intuition had been telling her for weeks that something was off. Bob had become distant, his long shifts more frequent, and his phone calls, always private, always sneaky, set off alarm bells in her mind. Linda was no stranger to the quiet whispers of infidelity in small towns. She'd heard the rumors, the gossip that traveled fast in Oak Ridge, but it wasn't until last week, when Bob's behavior grew even more erratic, that Linda decided to follow her suspicions. She was not the jealous type, but there was something about Bob's late nights and the strange texts she found on his phone that made her start to question everything. That fateful day, Linda had made a decision. She would finally confront him. With a calm determination, she grabbed her keys and left the house, her heart pounding with every step. Bob wasn't home, and she knew he wouldn't be back until later that evening, but she had a feeling he wasn't alone. As she pulled into the driveway of a secluded cabin just outside town, Linda's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't planned to go this far, but something inside urged her to investigate further. The cabin had once been a place of solitude for Bob, a retreat for fishing trips and quiet weekends away from the pressure of his job. He often said it was his personal space, but today it would be the place where everything changed. Linda parked her car a few hundred yards away, hoping to remain unseen. The cabin was nestled in a small grove of trees, surrounded by a private yard. She walked quietly, careful not to make a sound, her breath shallow as she crept closer to the window. She peered through the thick curtains, her stomach twisting in anticipation. What she saw next froze her blood. There, in the dimly lit room, was Bob, her husband, lying in bed, naked, with a man she recognized instantly, Darren Lawson. Darren was the town's mechanic, a man Linda had seen only in passing. He was also known to be openly gay, a fact that was rarely discussed in their small town. But what stunned Linda more than the sight of her husband in bed with another man was the sudden realization of the betrayal that had been happening under her nose for months. The pieces of her marriage, every subtle shift in Bob's behavior, every unexplained absence, came crashing down on her. Linda stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. She felt a wave of rage and disbelief swell inside her, threatening to choke her. The man she had trusted, the man she had spent years building a life with, was not only unfaithful, but was with someone she knew. Someone she had seen regularly, someone who had always been polite but distant, someone who had always seemed too familiar with Bob. Her mind raced with thoughts of how to confront him, how to make him understand the depth of her hurt. But before she could make any decisions, an idea took root in her mind, dark and dangerous. What if they both paid for this? Linda didn't know what drove her to it. Was it the shock, the hurt, or was it the overwhelming need for revenge? Whatever it was, she found herself walking toward her car with a cold resolve. The idea had come to her so suddenly, it felt as though it was not even her own. But it was there, unrelenting and powerful. As she drove back into town, she made a stop at a local store, buying something she never thought she would need. A small bottle of sulfuric acid, carefully hidden beneath her jacket. By the time she arrived home, her thoughts were racing faster than ever. The anger, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all felt too much to bear. As she prepared to confront Bob, she realized she had crossed a line. There would be no turning back now. The acid was waiting in her car, just a few steps away. Linda's heart pounded as she unlocked the front door. Bob would be home soon. The confrontation was inevitable. But she hadn't counted on the power of her emotions, and she hadn't counted on the consequences that would follow. It was the moment that would alter the course of her life forever, the moment when everything she had known and loved slipped from her grasp. The house was eerily quiet when Linda returned home, the air inside thick with tension. The harsh rays of the sun had begun to wane, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Her fingers trembled as she locked the door behind her, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She stood still for a moment, gathering her thoughts, trying to shake off the fury that still simmered beneath her skin. But no matter how much she tried to calm herself, the image of Bob and Darren tangled in that bed kept replaying in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, it was as if the betrayal was happening all over again. The sting of it was unbearable. Linda's mind raced, the thoughts so tangled, it was hard to know where one ended and another began. But one thought was clear. She needed answers. She needed closure, and above all, she needed him to understand the extent of the hurt he had caused. If Bob thought he could get away with this, if he thought he could tear apart everything they had built, he was gravely mistaken. She moved to the kitchen, almost mechanically. Her hand reached for the bottle in the drawer, small, inconspicuous, yet brimming with potential to change everything. Linda stared at the bottle for a long moment. The acid. It was powerful, dangerous, and could easily destroy someone's life, physically and emotionally. She had no intention of using it on Bob, not at first anyway. But in her mind, the idea of him feeling the same searing pain that she felt was too tempting to ignore. He needed to know the damage he had done, to feel the rawness of what he had ripped apart. But what would the consequences be if she went through with it? Would it truly satisfy the rage that churned in her gut? Would it be enough to make him pay? The thoughts were spiraling, each one louder than the last. There was no turning back from this path. She could already hear the argument in her head, the confrontation that was sure to come when Bob walked through that door. Would he be sorry? Would he beg for forgiveness? Or would he blame her, accuse her of overreacting, of not understanding him? Linda didn't know what to expect, but one thing was certain. Bob's life was about to change forever, whether he was ready for it or not. As the clock ticked closer to 8 p.m., Linda found herself staring out the window, waiting for the headlights of Bob's patrol car to appear down the street. Every minute stretched on longer than the last. She had to make sure she was ready, that everything would unfold exactly as she planned. The acid had been carefully hidden under a pile of clothes in her car, tucked away where no one would find it. When Bob's car finally turned into the driveway, Linda's stomach tightened. He was home, and so was her fate. She could hear his footsteps on the porch, the creak of the door as he stepped inside. His voice came through the hallway, muffled at first. "Linda, you home?" She didn't answer right away, wanting to give him a moment to settle in, to feel the weight of what was about to unfold. She wasn't sure what she was going to say yet, but she knew it had to be something that would force him to see the gravity of his betrayal. Something that would make him feel the same shock, the same disbelief that had threatened to tear her apart just hours earlier. Finally, Bob appeared in the doorway, his face brightening when he saw her standing there. "Hey, hun," he said, his voice low and casual, a tone that seemed completely out of place given the emotional storm that had just passed through her. "How was your day?" Linda didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to face him fully, her eyes narrowing. His smile faltered slightly under her gaze. "How was my day?" she repeated, the words leaving her mouth like daggers. "How was your day, Bob?" Bob blinked, clearly thrown off by the tone in her voice. "What's wrong, Linda? You sound upset." He took a step closer, reaching out to touch her arm, but she quickly pulled away. "Don't touch me," she said sharply, her voice now trembling with emotion. "You have some explaining to do, Bob." The sudden shift in her demeanor made him take a step back. He was no longer the confident sheriff who ruled the town. In that moment, he was a man caught off guard. "What do you mean?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Linda's breath caught as her mind replayed the image of him in that bed with Darren. The betrayal, the deception, the lies. "I saw you, Bob," she said, the words coming out in a harsh whisper, a sob lodged in her throat. "I saw you with Darren at the cabin," his face drained of color. For a split second, Linda could see a flash of panic in his eyes before he quickly masked it with an expression of disbelief. Linda, you don't know what you think you saw, he said, his voice soft but tinged with a note of warning. I know exactly what I saw, Linda replied, her fists clenched by her sides. You were in bed with him, Bob. With him. How long has this been going on? Bob opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He took another step back, as if he were trying to create distance. But Linda wasn't finished. The pain was too raw, too fresh. You've been lying to me for God knows how long. All those nights out, all those secret phone calls, and now I know why. Bob's eyes flicked toward the kitchen table, where Linda had left the bottle of acid lying on the counter. His eyes narrowed, and a flash of recognition passed through his expression. What's that? He asked, his voice suddenly strained. What's that doing here? Linda stepped toward the counter slowly, keeping her eyes on him. She wasn't sure if she wanted to admit what she had brought with her, but there was something about the thought of his anger, his sense of entitlement, that made her want to show him just how much she had thought this through. The bottle was a symbol of her own unraveling, a representation of everything that was wrong with their marriage now. It's just a little something for you to remember this day by, Bob, she said, her voice eerily calm now. She stared at the bottle, then back at him. You wanted a change in your life? Well, I'm giving it to you. Bob stood there, his face flushed with anger now. Are you threatening me? His voice raised slightly. You think this is going to scare me? Linda smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. I think you need to understand what you've done to me, to us, to everything we built. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, as the weight of her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Bob took a step toward her, but this time, Linda didn't flinch. Her heart was steady, her resolve even steadier. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. The air was thick with tension as Linda and Bob stood across from each other, the distance between them heavy with unspoken words. The weight of the confrontation hung in the air, like an approaching storm. Bob's face was flushed with anger and confusion, his eyes darting between Linda and the bottle of sulfuric acid on the counter. His jaw clenched, his body language defensive. But Linda felt a strange sense of calm. She had already crossed a line in her mind. The acid, the confrontation, it was all part of the plan. The emotions coursing through her were too tangled to be understood entirely. But one thing was clear. She couldn't let him walk away from this unscathed. Not when everything had been shattered. Bob cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. You don't know what you're talking about, Linda. He paused, his gaze flicking again to the bottle. What is that? What are you planning to do with that? You're out of your mind if you think. Out of my mind? Linda's voice was low, controlled, but beneath the calm exterior was a maelstrom of hurt and anger. You're the one who's been living a lie. You're the one who betrayed me. And you think I'm crazy for being upset? Bob shook his head slowly, his hands rising to massage his temples as if trying to clear his thoughts. He was trying to steady himself, but Linda could see that he was unraveling, the facade of control slipping away. This wasn't the man she had married. He was a stranger to her now. You don't understand. It's not what you think, Bob said, his voice now pleading, though the words felt hollow. It's not like that, Linda. Darren and I, we were just trying to figure things out. It wasn't meant to hurt you. It wasn't meant to figure things out? Linda cut him off sharply, the bitterness in her voice cutting through the air like a blade. You were sleeping with him, Bob, right under my nose. And now you want to justify it? After everything we've been through? Bob stepped closer, his hands outstretched, his tone softening, but it only made Linda feel more detached. Linda, I love you. You have to believe me. I never meant for this to happen, but I've been struggling with this for so long. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. Linda's chest tightened as his words hung in the air. She had once believed in that love, that promise they made to each other years ago. But now hearing him speak, she realized that all of it, everything she had believed in, had been a lie. The man she had married had been living a life that she had never known. And the worst part, he still expected her to believe in him. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at the bottle again, the acid now seeming to pulse in the dim light of the kitchen. It was a quiet reminder of just how far she was willing to go to make him feel the same despair she felt. "Do you think you can just apologize and make everything go away, Bob?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with an icy edge. "Do you think that I'll just forgive you? After everything?" Bob didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her with a mixture of guilt and desperation, his eyes reflecting a fear that he hadn't shown in years. But his fear wasn't of losing her. It was the fear of something else. The realization that Linda was no longer the woman he had married. She wasn't the quiet, trusting housewife anymore. She was someone new, someone who had seen through the cracks in their perfect life. "I never wanted to hurt you, Linda," he said again, his voice growing softer, almost pleading. "Please, I never wanted this. I love you and I—" "Stop," she interrupted, her voice rising now. "Stop lying to me." She could feel the anger rising within her again. It burned her chest, seared through her like fire. She stepped closer to the counter, her fingers curling around the bottle of acid. The cold plastic, a stark contrast to the heat of her fury. Bob's eyes widened as he saw her reach for it, his entire body tensing as if he instinctively knew what she might do next. "Linda, don't," he said, his voice now tinged with panic. "You don't want to do this. It's just a mistake, okay? We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work through it. You're angry and I understand that, but you can't do something you'll regret. Please, just put the bottle down." But Linda didn't move. She stood there staring at him, the bottle a physical representation of everything she had wanted to do in that moment. She wanted him to hurt. She wanted him to understand what it felt like to have everything ripped away, to have trust betrayed in the most intimate way possible. The silence stretched between them again, thick with tension, and for a moment Linda almost considered backing down. She almost convinced herself to let it go, to try to salvage whatever was left of their marriage. But the hurt, the anger, the betrayal, these emotions were too much to contain. She could feel herself slipping further into the dark, and there was no way out. "You've already destroyed this marriage, Bob," she said quietly, the words more final than she had ever intended them to be. "You destroyed us, and now I'm going to make you feel it." Bob's face contorted with a mixture of anger, fear, and confusion. "This is insane, Linda. You can't be serious. You're going to ruin everything over this?" Linda's grip on the bottle tightened. "You think I care about this house, this life we built? It doesn't mean anything anymore. You destroyed it. You destroyed me." For a moment they stood there, just staring at each other, the tension palpable in the space between them. Bob's face fell, his expression one of defeat, and for the first time Linda saw the cracks in his own facade. He was no longer the sheriff, the protector, the man she had once trusted. He was just a man who had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. And in that moment, Linda knew there was no going back. But just as she stepped forward, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted their standoff. The unmistakable hum of a vehicle's engine was followed by the sound of a door slamming. It was only then that Linda realized how much time had passed. Her heart skipped a beat. Someone else was here. Without thinking, she quickly slipped the bottle of acid into her purse, the weight of it suddenly feeling like a burden. She glanced at Bob, whose expression had now shifted to one of confusion and fear. He hadn't heard the car. He hadn't realized that someone was approaching. Before either of them could speak, the door creaked open, and a voice echoed through the hallway. "Linda, Bob, are you guys here?" Linda froze. It was Darren. The door to the living room creaked open slowly, and Darren's voice, faintly uncertain, echoed through the hallway. "Linda? Bob? Are you guys here?" His tone was light, almost casual, but the sound of it made Linda's heart race even faster than before. Bob's head snapped toward the hallway, his expression shifting from one of rage and confusion to panic. The situation had just gone from bad to worse. The last person he wanted to see right now, the person he had been sneaking around behind Linda's back with, was standing outside the living room. Linda's pulse quickened. What had she done? She had been so consumed with her emotions, with the rage and betrayal that surged through her veins, that she hadn't heard the car pull up. Darren, oblivious to the confrontation inside, was moments away from walking into the storm. "Darren, stay out there!" Bob's voice was sharp, but it cracked with a note of desperation. "It's not a good time." But Darren, perhaps more curious than cautious, stepped inside anyway. His tall frame filled the doorway, and his eyes locked onto Linda before moving to Bob, who was now standing rigid by the counter. There was a slight awkwardness in the way Darren stood there, as if he wasn't sure whether he had just walked in on something private or if he was just another part of this mess. "Hey, Linda," Darren greeted her, his voice light, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Bob said you might be here. I just wanted to—" He stopped short when he saw the expression on Linda's face. She could feel the heat of her anger radiating from her body, her heart pounding in her chest. His easygoing demeanor was a stark contrast to the fire that blazed within her. "Don't," she said quietly, cutting him off before he could finish his sentence. Her voice was thick with emotion, but the words came out with a steady authority. "Just don't." Darren's smile faded, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Linda, are you okay? You look a little off." The words stung her more than she expected. She wasn't off. She was furious, betrayed, shattered. She was a woman whose entire world had just come crumbling down in front of her, and here he was, acting like it was no big deal. Darren had been a willing participant in the destruction of her life, and yet he had the audacity to look at her like this was just some small misunderstanding. Linda's grip on the bottle in her purse tightened, but she forced herself to let go. There were more pressing things to deal with. She needed to get control of the situation before it spiraled further out of hand. Bob's voice rose again, but this time it was tinged with frustration. "Darren, I told you, it's not a good time. Maybe you should go." Darren's gaze flicked between Linda and Bob, taking in the tension that was palpable in the room. He glanced back at Linda, who stood motionless, her eyes burning with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "What's going on, Bob?" "Linda?" His voice held a note of caution now, sensing that something was very wrong. Linda turned to face Bob, her eyes flashing with a coldness that took him off guard. "You think this is just a bad time?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You think I'll just forgive you for what you've done? For what both of you have done?" Bob's face twisted, his hands up in defense, his voice growing quieter, almost pleading. "Linda, please, just—" "No, Bob," she cut him off, her tone deadly calm. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her eyes now fully fixed on Darren. "You don't get to apologize. Neither of you do." Darren shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of the moment. "Linda, Don't you dare, Darren," she spat, her voice seething with venom. "You've been sleeping with my husband. You've been tearing apart my life. And now you're here, pretending like nothing's wrong." The words felt like they came from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere dark and raw, as though they had been waiting to explode for days, weeks, even months. She was no longer the woman who had been waiting for Bob to come home from his late shifts, to kiss her goodnight, to pretend that their life was just as perfect as it seemed. She was someone else now, someone who had seen behind the veil and couldn't unsee what had been done. Darren's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as though he was trying to find the right words. But there were no words that could undo what had already been done. Bob took a step forward, his hands shaking slightly, his expression one of helplessness. "Please, Linda, just listen." Linda snapped her gaze back to him, the weight of everything bearing down on her like a crushing wave. "I listened long enough," she said, her voice low but filled with a sharp edge. "I listened while you lied to me. I listened while you betrayed me. And now, you want me to forgive you?" Bob's shoulders slumped, his face crumpling as if he had already realized that everything he thought he could fix had already slipped through his fingers. The truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Linda could see the panic in his eyes, the fear of what was coming next. She wasn't going to forgive him. Not now, not ever. For a long moment, the three of them stood there in the silence, a terrible kind of stillness hanging over them. Linda's mind raced. Every part of her wanted to scream, to tear the two of them apart. The acid was still in her purse, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she wondered if that was the only way to get the kind of closure she needed. But then she looked at Darren again, and something shifted inside her. The reality of what had happened settled on her like a weight she could no longer ignore. Bob hadn't just betrayed her, he had stolen a part of her. But Darren, he had played an active role. He had been a willing participant, and Linda could see now, more clearly than ever, that he had never cared about the pain he was causing. The silence stretched on, and Linda's mind seemed to snap back into focus. She realized that there was no justice in continuing down this path. No satisfaction in making them both suffer. The consequences were already too great. Finally, Linda took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of everything that had happened. "You need to leave, Darren," she said, her voice steady but unyielding. "Both of you need to leave." Now Darren opened his mouth to protest, but one look from Linda silenced him. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before nodding slowly, his face tight with discomfort. "Okay," he muttered, backing toward the door. "I'll go, but we should talk about this. Both of us, Linda." "Not now," she said quietly, turning away from him. "Just go." As Darren stepped back outside and the door closed behind him, Linda finally let herself breathe. But the relief was fleeting. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. She turned to Bob, her eyes hardening as she faced him for the first time since the moment she caught him with Darren. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice ice cold. "You'll have to live with the consequences, Bob. All of them." Bob didn't speak. He just stood there, his eyes cast down as if the weight of what he had done was finally crashing over him. Linda didn't wait for him to respond. There was nothing left to say. She turned and walked toward the front door, leaving the past and them behind. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur for Linda. The house, which once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed more like a prison, each room a silent reminder of the life she had tried so hard to preserve. The stillness was suffocating, every corner carrying the weight of her decisions. Bob had left that night, unable to argue or fight back. He had packed a bag and walked out without another word, his presence lingering only in the air, thick with unresolved tension. But it wasn't over. Linda knew that. The silence she had chosen for the moment would not last. She had not yet processed the gravity of what had happened. The acid, the confrontation, Darren's hasty departure. It was all too much. And yet somewhere deep down, she knew the worst was still to come. 3 days later, the phone rang in the middle of the morning, pulling Linda from a fitful sleep. Her hand moved slowly toward the bedside table, still feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Hello? Miss McKinney?" A calm, professional voice echoed through the line. "My name is Detective Ethan Walker. I'm calling from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department." Linda's heart skipped a beat. Her thoughts immediately returned to that night, the confrontation with Bob, Darren's sudden departure, the acid that still lay in her purse. She held her breath, waiting for him to continue. "I need to ask you a few questions about the incident involving your husband, Bob McKinney, and his associate, Darren Pierce. Are you available to speak right now?" A sharp pang of dread twisted in her stomach. Incident. She was barely keeping herself together, and now a detective was calling about her life, the same life that had just unraveled in front of her. Linda couldn't bring herself to speak for a moment, but the detective's steady tone calmed her just enough to focus. "I'm available," she said, her voice strained but composed. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand this must be a difficult time, but we're investigating some unusual circumstances surrounding the deaths of two men found in an abandoned warehouse just outside of town. Both of them were last seen in connection with your husband's activities." Linda's pulse quickened, but she kept herself steady. She couldn't afford to let the detective hear the fear in her voice. "What do you mean?" What happened to them? Both men, your husband, Bob McKinney, and Darren Pierce, were found dead in the warehouse yesterday. It appears that they were victims of a violent crime. We have evidence suggesting that there might have been some sort of struggle and some injuries consistent with the use of a caustic substance. We'll need you to come down to the station for a formal statement. Linda's stomach dropped. She struggled to make sense of the words. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her for a second. Bob's dead, she whispered. And Darren? I understand this is shocking news, Ms. McKinney. Detective Walker's voice softened. But I need you to come in. It's very important that we get your statement as soon as possible. Can you come down today? She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. The acid. It couldn't have been possible, could it? She had been angry, but the idea of killing him had never crossed her mind. She had only wanted him to feel what she felt, to understand the depth of her hurt. But now she had to face the unimaginable. The very thing she had feared, the very thing she had played out in her darkest moments, had come to pass. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady again. I'll be there. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department was a modest building, nothing extravagant, but it carried an air of authority. Linda sat in the waiting area for what felt like hours, her mind reeling as she tried to piece together the events of the past week. How had everything gone so terribly wrong? And what had truly happened that night? Finally, a tall man in his mid-40s, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, walked into the room. His eyes were sharp, his demeanor calm, and there was an unmistakable presence about him. Detective Ethan Walker. His face held the kind of quiet authority that made people sit up straighter when he spoke. Ms. McKinney, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Thank you for coming in today. I know this isn't easy. Please, follow me. Linda stood, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she was certain it wouldn't be good. The small interview room felt cold and sterile. There was a table between them, and as Linda sat down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being scrutinized. Not just as a suspect, but as a woman whose life had been shattered. Detective Walker took a seat across from her, pulling out a file from a manila folder, his expression unreadable. Ms. McKinney, I'm going to ask you some questions about the events surrounding the deaths of Bob McKinney and Darren Pierce. I know this must be difficult for you, but I need you to be as honest and clear as possible. Anything you can tell me might help. Linda nodded, her throat tight. She hadn't expected things to go this way, but she had no choice but to follow along. I understand, she replied quietly. Walker took a breath, opening the folder and glancing down at the notes. The incident that led to their deaths took place 2 nights ago, and we have evidence of a struggle in the warehouse where their bodies were found. There were signs of physical altercations between the two men, along with a significant amount of acid burns. It seems as though the acid was used in the attack. Linda's stomach twisted. She wanted to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't even tell if he knew it was her acid. The thought was like a knot tightening in her chest. Ms. McKinney, we've also learned that Bob McKinney and Darren Pierce were involved in a secret relationship. Is that something you were aware of? Linda's eyes stung, but she held his gaze. I found out recently, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside. A few days ago, actually. I confronted them. Walker's eyebrows raised slightly, and he scribbled something down. And what happened when you confronted them? Linda's heart thudded in her chest as she recalled that night, but she kept her voice controlled. She hesitated. What was she supposed to say? I found them together. I confronted Bob. I was angry. I didn't know what to do. And what about the acid? Walker asked, his voice softening just slightly. Do you have any idea how it ended up at the scene? Linda paused. Her thoughts raced, but she knew she couldn't lie. The truth might be her only saving grace now. I had it in the house, she said, her voice quieter now. I was angry. I wasn't thinking clearly. I never meant for anyone to die. Detective Walker studied her for a moment, his gaze unyielding. And yet, both men are dead, Miss McKinney. Do you understand the gravity of that? Linda's eyes welled up with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. I do. The detective leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. We'll need to follow up with further questions, but for now this will be enough. I'll be in touch, Miss McKinney. Linda stood and walked out of the interview room, the weight of the investigation settling on her shoulders like an anchor. She had just opened the door to a new nightmare. The days that followed Linda's meeting with Detective Walker were the longest of her life. Every minute felt like an eternity as she waited for any news, any indication of how things would unfold. The weight of her words, the confessions she had made, the revelations she had let slip, hung heavily on her mind. She had never meant for it to go this far. She had never imagined that the truth would spiral into such devastation. The media picked up the story, but the details were scant, just enough to keep the town talking. The murder of Bob McKinney and Darren Pierce made local headlines, but no one really knew the full extent of the betrayal. Not yet, and that fact for the moment kept Linda from completely breaking down. At least in the eyes of the public, she was still just a grieving wife. Detective Walker's investigation continued, with more questions and more evidence being brought to light. What had started as a routine investigation into the deaths of two men had now taken on a life of its own. The deeper the detective dug, the clearer it became that the deaths were not the random act of a criminal, but the result of a complex web of lies, secrets, and explosive emotions. A week after Linda's interview, the phone rang again. Ms. McKinney? It was Detective Walker's voice on the other end. This time, there was something different about it, something colder, more businesslike. I need you to come in again. We've uncovered new evidence, and it's crucial that we speak to you. Linda's heart raced, her mind instantly going to the worst-case scenario. She had been expecting something like this. The acid, the confrontation, the lies, everything was now tangled together in a way that she couldn't control, and she had no idea how deep the investigation had gone. I'll be there, she said, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts to remain calm. When Linda arrived at the station, Detective Walker was waiting for her. He stood by the door looking every bit the seasoned investigator, his expression unreadable. He led her into a small room again, and this time there were no pleasantries. Sit down, Ms. McKinney, he said, his voice sharp. Linda sat, the chair feeling colder than it had the first time. She had been expecting this. She had known that the truth would eventually come out. Everything she had tried to bury would surface. Detective Walker sat across from her, placing a file on the table. He opened it slowly, flipping through the pages with deliberate precision. Linda felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. The room seemed to close in on her, and the weight of her actions began to feel unbearable. I'm not going to beat around the bush, he said, his voice stern but not unkind. We've uncovered surveillance footage from the warehouse where Bob McKinney and Darren Pierce were found. The footage shows the two men in the warehouse before the attack happened. It also shows someone else, someone we now believe was involved in the confrontation. Linda's stomach turned. Someone else? Her heart raced as she stared at the detective. Who? She asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. Walker looked up from the file, meeting her eyes with a gaze that felt both probing and calculating. You, Ms. McKinney. Linda's blood ran cold. The room spun around her, her breath catching in her throat. How? How could they possibly know? I'm not saying you were the one who killed them, he continued, but it seems pretty clear that you were at the scene. The footage shows you entering the warehouse, the bottle of acid in your hand. It's all there, Ms. McKinney. Linda's mind raced. The footage. She had walked into that warehouse, but she hadn't planned to kill them. She hadn't done anything, had she? I I don't remember, she said, her voice shaky. I don't remember going to the warehouse. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was angry. I I was just angry. Walker's expression softened for a moment, but he remained professional. I understand that, but you need to understand something. This isn't just about a crime of passion. The evidence we've gathered paints a picture that goes beyond your anger. The warehouse wasn't just a random location. It was a place where Bob and Darren had been meeting in secret, a place they thought no one would find. You were the one who tracked them there. And what we found next? It's not going to be easy for you. Linda's chest tightened. She felt like she was suffocating, but there was no air left in her lungs to cry out. The truth, whatever it was closing in on her. And it was only a matter of time before the whole world knew what she had done. I never meant for this to happen, she whispered again, her voice a broken murmur. I swear, I just, I couldn't think straight. I just wanted him to feel the same pain I did. I never meant to kill anyone. I didn't do it. Walker leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. We don't know the full story yet, Miss McKinney, but what we do know is that you were there, and now we need to figure out how the events played out. You're not a suspect yet, but I need your cooperation. We have more questions, and you need to be honest with us. Linda swallowed hard. It felt like the walls were closing in. The pressure, the lies, the secrets. It was all too much. But she couldn't stop herself now. She couldn't take it back. The spiral had started, and there was no way to pull herself out of it. I'll tell you everything, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Everything. That evening, Detective Walker left the station with a heavy burden on his shoulders. Linda had agreed to tell him everything she remembered, though the details were murky, distorted by the anger and pain she had felt in those moments. But the footage was undeniable. She had been there. She had been the one to walk into the warehouse. And no amount of pleading or crying could change that fact. The investigation was far from over, and there were still too many unanswered questions. But Linda's role in the deaths of Bob and Darren had become all too clear. And as the detective pieced together the last bits of the puzzle, he knew that the truth was even darker than anyone could have imagined. The weeks following Linda's confession were a blur of legal proceedings, interviews, and a growing media frenzy. Riverside County was abuzz with the news of the murders, the betrayal, the intrigue, the sharp twist that had left two men dead. And at the center of it all, Linda McKinney was the face of the tragedy. The wife, the woman who had been scorned, the woman whose anger had spiraled into a deadly, irreversible action. Linda had become a symbol of grief and rage, her image plastered across newspapers and news broadcasts. But it wasn't the public eye that tormented her. It was the gnawing guilt that consumed her every waking moment. The life she had known was shattered, and though she was technically free, a part of her felt like a prisoner in her own skin. The trial came swiftly. Linda's defense team, while competent, couldn't deny the facts that the prosecution had gathered. The surveillance footage showing Linda walking into the warehouse was indisputable. The bottle of acid she had carried that night was later found at the scene, and traces of it were found on Bob and Darren's bodies. The confrontation, her rage, was evident, and now it seemed there was nothing left to do but to wait for the verdict. Detective Walker, who had been an observer from the beginning, sat in the back of the courtroom during the trial, watching everything unfold with a professional's detached eye. He had uncovered the evidence, had connected the dots, but now it was out of his hands. It was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about finding justice, whatever that would mean for Linda McKinney. Moments, Linda wondered if there was redemption left for her. Would she ever find peace? Or was she doomed to live with the consequences of that one night forever? Only time would tell.